Let's create a mixed media card using embossing powder, distress watercolor pencils, and distress sprays. Hey everyone, it's Joy here and welcome to my channel. Okay, I'm going to start by stamping my image for my watercolor pencils. So I am using scrapbook.com's Wildflowers stamp set. I am stamping this on some of their mixed media white cardstock. It's a real good thick cardstock, perfect for stuff like this. And I'm going to stamp this with Archival Jet Black ink because I'm going to be using some distressed products, and this ink stays nice and crispy black, which is fantastic for your stamped images. So I'm just rubbing my hand over my stamp because I've not stamped it yet, so I'm just letting the oils get onto the stamp set. That way the ink will really adhere to it, but I do end up stamping this a couple times. And then we are going to use distress watercolor pencils to color these images. Like I mentioned, this is a mixed media card. We're going to be using the distress watercolor pencils, distress spray, distress ink. We're going to be using a stencil, white embossing powder. Like, we've got all the fun things going on this card. So I'm using a few colors, not a ton. I will be using Ripe Persimmon, which I believe is this color here. And it is from set 5 of the Distress Watercolor sets. I believe there's 6 sets. And so this one is from set 5. I'll be using Abandoned Coral and Spun Sugar from set 6. Rustic Wilderness from set 3 and Mowed Lawn from set 4. So I'm adding the pencil, the color where I want it to be the darkest, and then using a little bit of water and a very small paintbrush to blend out from there. And I am going to come back after this is dry and add a little more detail with the watercolor pencil. So again, just dipping a little bit of water, starting where the color is, and then blending it out to the tips of the petals or the other areas of the flower that is not colored. I am also going to use the Abandoned Coral for the other 2 flowers there, and then there's really small little flower buds, and that's where I'm going to use the Spun Sugar. I think these colors are absolutely beautiful. I love them together. I love these kind of peachy pinks and corally oranges. Those are some of my favorite colors. I'm also highlighting some of the stamped areas on the petals where you have like the centers of the flowers, or you have like the little lines coming down on the tips of the petals, making those a little bit darker. I feel like this is really easy coloring. Anybody can do this, even if you're nervous about coloring or don't think that you're good at coloring. This is not hard. This is really super simple. And I like it because it's also kind of quick, but you get really, really beautiful results. So here is that Abandoned Coral. Let me add a few more little darker areas, and then we can blend that out. So I'm adding some darker, because this is a bigger flower, so I felt like I could add some more color at the tips of the petals and then kind of bring that in between the tips and the centers and have a lighter area in that center part of the petal. So let's finish coloring this guy here. I did leave in the coloring. I know some people like to watch the coloring, so I didn't speed it up too fast. So I hope that you guys enjoy that. You can let me know if that's something you do like or whatever down in the comments if you want. Okay, like I mentioned, I'm using 2 greens. Oh, here's the Spun Sugar. So again, I'm not going to blend these because it's so small. I'm just going to color them with the Spun Sugar. I'm not going to blend it out with water. It just didn't need that. So let me do these little guys down here. And what I was going to say is, again, I'm using 2 greens, Rustic Wilderness and Mowed Lawn. I'm going to use Mowed Lawn first for most of the petals, and then Rustic Wilderness for a couple of I think there's about 3 of the petals that are around that largest flower. So I'm just trying to find my colors here. I did take out my sets ahead of time and put them on my desk, but I don't like to take the colored pencils out because I'm afraid I'm going to put them back in the wrong. I guess I could read on the back. It tells you the colors. That's just a lot of work. So anyways, I just kept them in the container until I needed to use them. I'm tracing along the vein in the leaves especially the smaller ones. The bigger ones, I'll add a little bit of color at the base. And like I mentioned, I am going to come back in after I'm done coloring everything and just add a little more detail with the colored pencils, but I'm not going to add water to it, but I'll show you what I mean here in a minute. But look at how lovely this is. I love this cluster of I almost said feathers, of flowers. And in the stamp set, the Wildflowers, you get another cluster and then you get some individual flowers and leaves and things like that. It's a really nice stamp set. And it does have a coordinating die, which I love. So now I'm using water to blend out the leaves. Starting where you have the color obviously makes sense, but I do want to have some lighter areas and darker areas. And what can happen when you're blending it out is sometimes it can blend a little too much. So in some of the, well, on kind of on everything, I felt like it just kind of blended out a lot. And so let me come back in, which I'm going to do after I color, with the Rustic Wilderness. But I had to come back in with that mowed lawn because I missed some little pieces down there. And I love Rustic Wilderness. I think it is such a good dark green. I think it's so, so pretty. And I am following along the veins of that leaf as well and adding a little bit of color against that flower. And then we'll blend it out. So when I come back in with the watercolor pencil, I do want to make sure that it's dry. I'm starting on the leaves first. They actually dried pretty quick. And I want to darken at the base of the leaves, add a little more detail. So that's what I'm doing here. And I'm going lightly. I am not pressing down hard. I don't want to really see lines from the colored pencil. Even if you get a little bit, that's okay. But as you can see, it's adding a little more detail, adding a little of those darker areas, and then it lets those lighter areas really show. And I'm going to do the same thing for the flowers. So once again, I will bring in abandoned coral and ripe persimmon and add some detail. Especially to that bigger flower, I was able to add a good amount of detail, which was a lot of fun. So going back over the areas that I already had the darker color present and lightly going at some of the tips of the petals. But again, I'm going lightly over everything. I'm just going to continue to go over it to build that color. But as you can see, that's making a huge difference in how that flower now looks compared to what it looked like before. And it was pretty before. And so you could absolutely leave it that way and it would be gorgeous. But I felt I wanted to have a little more drama between the darker and lighter areas of the flowers. So that's the ripe persimmon. Let me grab abandoned coral. And we will do the same thing. So on this flower, again at that base, I will add a little bit to the center of the flower. And I believe I added a couple spots to the tips of the, nope, maybe I did not. Okay, I did add to the tips of this flower here, very lightly, but look at how already building that color and adding the darker to the center really makes these petals just stand out and look so, so pretty. I love when I'm coloring images to be able to do stuff like this to really make them stand out and to show, like I mentioned, kind of some drama between the lighter and darker areas. I think that looks really pretty on colored images. So after we finish this, then we can get on to our background, which is going to be a lot of fun. I love how this background turned out, and I did make a square card. My card itself measures 5 by 5. The card panel was 4 3/4 by 4 3/4. Let's use the coordinating die to die cut this out. I'm going to tape this in place and run it through my die cut machine. And then we will have our floral image and we can start on our fun background. So in my MISTI, I am going to stamp this background print. This is Hero Arts, I think it's pronounced Prose bold prints. And I am going to prep it with an anti-static powder tool. This is the mixed media cardstock as well from scrapbook.com. And I'm going to use clear embossing ink and we're going to do white embossing powder because we're going to let some of that reveal through our inking of the background. So I'm going to ink this up, and it did not have to be perfect. It actually turned out perfect, but it didn't need to be a perfect stamping because I'm actually going to distress it in a way in a second once I get that powder sprinkled on. We're going to take a dry paintbrush and brush some of it off. So normally when I'm stamping, when I'm doing embossing, I will stamp it 2 or 3 times to really make sure I get an awesome image. But again, I wasn't worried about that, so I'm going to sprinkle that before I dry it or heat it. I'm going to take my dry paintbrush and go around the edges, somewhat a little bit in the center, and just brush away some of that embossing powder because I want the background to feel a bit distressed. And it's not something that you would necessarily, I mean, you notice it. If I'm looking at the background right now, you do notice it when you're looking at it. If it's just sitting there, it's not something you're going to notice. So if it's not what you want to do, you could leave this part off. But I like it. I think it looks really fabulous. So once I'm done doing that, then I'm going to heat it with my heat tool. Okay, so you can see that I brushed some of that away. I'm going to come inside just a little bit, and I'm just blowing off the excess powder, and then now I can heat it up with my heat tool, and we're going to have this great little background. And the print is really tiny and fine, which I think is a lot of fun, and it's going to give this background texture. So that's another way to add texture outside of pastes or, you know, adding die cuts or embossing folders. You can do embossing powder with a full like background image. So I think it looks really fun. All right, I'm going to spritz this with a little bit of water. This is our background that we just embossed, and I am using Distress Oxide spray and Salvaged Patina. I wanted a contrasting color that's going to stand out against our pretty flowers. And I'm just going to get this wet and move this around. So this is why you need like a mixed media cardstock or a watercolor cardstock, because I got this really wet. And I am going to heat it. I do have my heat tool on low, and I'm going to move it around a lot because we do have that embossing on the background. If you heat it for too long, it's going to melt away. So you don't want to get it over hot. And I also think maybe the water kind of helped a little bit, but I did move around my heat tool a lot and I had it on low. I'm just tapping off any of the excess that's just really pooling up, but I'm doing a lot of water because I want it to move around a lot. I need that spot to be a little bit bigger, so I'm going to add some more of that Salvaged Patina Distress Oxide spray, using my fingers to kind of get it to go where I want it to go. Adding a little bit more water to move it around. I think it looks so pretty. And look, you can see that print coming through. So again, on low, moving it, not keeping it in one spot for too long, because I don't want to melt away all that fun embossing powder. Then I'm using Distress Spritz in Fossilized Amber, and I'm going to splatter this on that background, mainly keeping it on the colored area. It's okay if a little bit gets on the white. I do want to leave some of that white space. And then splattering some of that Distress Oxide spray and Salvaged Patina. And then I'm going to set that aside to dry, and I'm going to splatter the flowers with both of those same colors, and I'll just dry it in between. I didn't want to leave the flowers just as is. I wanted them to have a little something too, but obviously if that's not your jam, you can leave it off. I think Tim Holtz says that, because I've never said that in my life and it just kind of came out. Maybe because I'm doing a mixed media card, my inner Tim Holtz came out. Okay, now that background is dry, I am using the Diamond Stitch Stencil from scrapbook.com, and I'm using Saltwater Taffy ink, and I'm using the little blender dauber sponges that go on your finger from scrapbook.com. I love these, you guys. They work so nice. But I'm just adding some areas of stenciling, and this is a really kind of I would call it a fine stencil, meaning it's not heavy. So when you ink up the whole thing, you're not going to have this crazy heavy image, but I'll show you, you can see just a little bit of that. That's a fun texture on top of the other texture from the embossing powder. Then I'm using my scissors to distress the edges, of course, because I feel like that's my new thing. And then in my MISTI, I'm going to stamp my sentiment using the Blooming Sentiments from scrapbook.com. And the sentiment I'm using says, "You make life lovely." And I'm going to ink that up with black ink. And then I can trim that out with my paper trimmer, and we'll have a nice little sentiment. And then we can get this card put together. So I added 1mm foam adhesive behind the flowers. I do want this to have a tad bit of dimension. And I'm going to lay that across that area that we colored. And then the sentiment can go in that white area. And that is also going to have, what did I use on here? Oh, I used 2mm foam adhesive on the sentiment. And then I can place that down. And then I will adhere this to a white A2 size card base. Nope, I say A2 size, that's automatic. A white 5x5 card base. Oh my gosh, that's so silly. And I love that white on white. I think it's so fun. And then we can take a look at this up close. I think this turned out so pretty. Look at all of that detail on the background from that print with the embossing powder. You have the stenciling and the inking, and of course the beautiful flowers with the Distress watercolor pencils. Thank you guys so much for stopping by and watching. I hope you feel inspired by this project, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have an amazing day.